Thanks for joining me on the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. In today's episode, I talked to Brian Harris, a co-founder and CEO of MedRhythms. I first met Brian via email in fall 2018 when I asked him if he would be a speaker for 5 Minute Genius in 2019. In 5 Minute Genius, we ask researchers and scientists and speakers to explain their work in normal human language in 5 minutes or less, and we enforce that with a timer and a cowbell. I think I can safely say that the audience that night was just blown away by Brian's work and enthusiasm, and I think you'll have the same reaction listening to this conversation. In this conversation, we are able to go a bit deeper than the 5 minutes we allotted to Brian in 2019, and every bit of it was interesting to me. I hope you enjoy it. So Brian, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I really appreciate you spending time with me on this. One of my favorite things to do is to talk to researchers about what they're doing, and I love your work. But before we dive into that, I was kind of hoping you could give us a little bit of background about where you grew up and how you got into neuroscience and the combination with that and music.
Absolutely. Well, Kate, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. So I appreciate the invitation to be on this podcast. And kudos to you for doing a podcast like this that really supports science and research from the state of Maine. I am from West Enfield, Maine, which is about 30 miles north of Bangor, so a very small town. In Maine, my undergrad was at the University of Maine. I studied psychology and minored in music. And that was sort of the beginning of my sort of foray into neuroscience. So when I started at the University of Maine, it wasn't sort of top of mind. I was much more actually into music and trying to figure out how music might be a part of my career, but knowing that music education was not the route that I wanted to take. And also music performance was exciting, but I didn't have that same passion for it. But I heard about music therapy and the idea that you could use music to help people recover from injuries and illnesses. And I fell in love with the concept, this idea that music could be helpful. And I actually had an opportunity while I was at the University of Maine one summer to intern with, at the time, the only private practicing music therapist in the state of Maine. And he was based out of Surrey. His name was Alan Wittenberg. He's not trained in neuroscience. He's what we consider more of a traditional music therapist, using music for well-being and mental health. And we were working with a boy who was 18 years old, but physically and cognitively functioning at about a 1-year-old level when we met him. So a very low functioning boy. And this was the first real life or hands-on music therapy session I had ever witnessed. And within the first 10 minutes of this boy being exposed to live music, he began cognitively functioning at a higher level than what anybody in his life had ever seen before. So the people who worked with him every day and his family actually came in the room and they were in tears because they couldn't believe how he was functioning. It was at that moment that I realized that that this was my calling in life, that I needed to be using music in this way. But B, while this was a sort of magical and wonderful thing to witness, there must be a reason why his brain allowed him to respond that way to music. And if we could answer that question, that's when I felt that we could truly harness the power of music and then replicate it to help a lot of people. And so that was the moment, so that was about junior year of UMaine, that I said, neuroscience is the path. Neuroscience is where I want to go, and I want to understand more about this. And so that's when I went on to get a master's degree in music therapy, and then focus my entire professional career on answering that question about how the music responds to how the brain responds to music, but how can we use that to be effective clinically?
So how do you figure out the brain part? Like, actually, is it as simple as doing a scan while someone's listening to music? Is it a combination of things? Like, this sounds like you came at it from a different angle than what most people think of with neuroscience, which is they've been diving into the brain for years and years and years. So how do you figure that part out?
Well, that's an interesting question. Also, because if you look at the field of music therapy historically, it started in about the 1950s as an established healthcare profession, and then has grown dramatically since then. One of my good colleagues and mentors, his name is Dr. Michael Tout, he's at the University of Toronto, is the founder of what's called Neurologic music therapy, which is the application of neuroscience of music for clinical outcomes. He's done most of the research in this area. And he always states that he knew the founders of the field of music therapy and thought that they always wanted music therapy to be a neuroscience approach field. However, in that time, as it was developing, there wasn't neuroscience to be able to explain how these results were possible. So they were doing clinical research and seeing clinical outcomes and hypothesizing what was happening neurologically. But it wasn't really until, say, the early mid-1990s, and then really in the past 2 decades, so since 2000, that we've really been able to connect the dots from a pure neuroscience perspective. So as we think about studying the neuroscience of music, part of it comes through cutting-edge technology, fMRIs, DTIs, these types of neuroimaging techniques. And then the other part comes from what we consider to be sort of more translational research, or translating that research into clinical practice, where we're studying functional outcomes. So people who have stroke or Parkinson's disease, how are they actually improving in response to the music? And so that's sort of been the 2 areas of most, where we've dived in most to over recent decades, is really the pure neuroscience, but also this clinical research, which is equally as important.
If I'm following you correctly, you are solidly in the clinical research part. Let's see what works. Let's get this helping people go through. This is actually a really good time for you to segue into MedRhythms and what it is you do, and explain how you are doing all of these really cool music application to neuroscience.
Yeah, so I started as you mentioned, as a clinician. So I've always come from the clinical angle of this, of wanting to do sort of clinical research. And we started MedRhythms originally as a therapy practice. So you could think of it much like a physical therapy practice or an occupational therapy practice, where we worked and contracted with hospitals, and we were treating patients in home who have neurologic injury and disease. So that spans everything from Parkinson's disease to stroke, traumatic brain injury, MS, cerebral palsy, autism. And what we found is that people were getting better faster with greater results. And we now had some of that neuroscience basis to understand how this might be possible and how we replicate it. Where we were seeing the most amount of improvement was specifically in an intervention that's called rhythmic auditory stimulation. And rhythmic auditory stimulation is essentially using music, specifically the rhythm of music, to improve walking following neurologic disease or injury. And so we were just trying to figure out, how do we help more people? And how do we bring this to more people? As you can imagine, there aren't many people who are trained in neurologic music therapy or the neuroscience of music. So bringing this to people was the challenge. And the answer to that is technology. And so part of MedRhythms, what we then did is we started a division where we're building digital therapeutics, meaning we're building technology that can replicate what clinicians are doing in practice to help bring it to more people. As part of building a digital therapeutic, there are things like the FDA that we have to be concerned with, and reimbursement and such, which means we're building a pipeline of products for each disease state. So we're building a product for stroke, a product for Parkinson's disease, a product for MS. And each one of these products actually has to go through clinical trials. So each one has to go through clinical research in order for us to get through FDA and to get onto market. And so where we've been focused a lot on is very specifically in the clinical application of music to improve movement through the technology that we're building. And so we've started in the stroke space. So we've done smaller feasibility studies looking at outcomes and using our product and using music to improve walking in the chronic stroke population. And currently we're in the midst of what is now a 7-site randomized control trial at the top rehab hospitals in the country to at a much larger scale trial. And then we're starting to start clinical trials in MS and Parkinson's disease as well. And we actually, Kate, for insider baseball here, we have an upcoming trial actually that's involved in neuroimaging as well. So actually looking at the intervention, but going to be looking at neuroimaging too. So we're starting to bridge that gap as well.
That is so cool. That's actually really cool. So when you say digital therapeutics, is there a way for you to describe, or I mean, you said it's a rhythm. So is it something as simple as a clapping, or is it tone-based? There's that question. And then the other question is, how do you get it? Because you personally cannot go to all these 7 clinic sites, right? So what are you providing for people to use and figuring out the best way to work it out?
Yeah, so as we think about, as clinicians, when we're delivering this specific intervention, so using rhythm to improve walking, it actually is fairly algorithmic in nature. The decision process is algorithmic in nature. And what I mean by that is, as we as clinicians watch somebody walk and we're doing our assessments, and then when we start to deliver music to them, we say, when you see subject do X, clinician do Y. When you see subject do Y, clinician do Z, right? Now, there are hundreds and thousands of X's and Y's, so that's where it becomes much more complex. However, what we've built is an actual autonomous platform. So we have sensors that connect to the shoe, so one that clips onto each shoe, that can actually collect the clinical grade biomechanics in real time. So your symmetry, your stride length, your cadence, your foot angles as they fly through space, that feeds into our algorithm, which is actually based upon an app in a smartphone. And then we've trained the algorithms to think like a clinician, so that when data from sensors come in, they see X, the algorithm itself actually changes music to do Y, as I just described it. So it's a closed loop system where data comes in and then the user listens to headphones and the music's delivered through the headphones. So we've built the system to be autonomous such that they don't need a clinician present in order to get the benefits of the intervention.
And do different diseases present with different impacts? And is that why you need to do one for stroke victims and Parkinson's, et cetera? Or is it just because that's some arbitrary breakdown?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that we get asked a lot. And the answer is yes, clinically, every disease state has a different gait presentation. In fact, every individual has a different gait presentation. And so one of the beauties of the technology is because we're getting such high fidelity data from the sensors, it can now be individualized to that person in that moment where they're functioning. So it's actually delivering an intervention based upon where they're functioning. However, how we think about rehabilitation for somebody with stroke is very different than we think about rehabilitation for somebody with Parkinson's disease. For example, somebody who's had a stroke, typically they're walking very slowly with a very slow cadence. So we're trying to increase their cadence, so the number of steps per minute that they take. We're trying to increase stride length, but we're also trying to increase their symmetry. So oftentimes they have one side that's affected. So their left side or their right side may not move the same way as the opposite side. So there are things that we do with the music or with the rhythmic stimulus to address those very specific pieces. So we do certain things to try to address symmetry and then try to address speed. For example, if we look at Parkinson's disease, typically those folks, when they have the movement disorder, they also slow their speed of walking, but they actually increase the number of steps that they take. So their cadence actually gets a lot faster, but they look like they're shuffling. So we actually have to take an opposite approach to them, where we're actually trying to slow down how many steps they take, but elongate their stride length. So each of these unique gait presentations creates different challenges from a technology perspective, but also from a clinical perspective of how we would respond. So we have to go through, and we actually think about the building of digital therapeutics much more like a pharmacological development than we do like a medical device development, meaning we go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials to figure out safety and efficacy, to actually make claims that this intervention improves X outcome. So it's actually much more similar to what we would think about like lab testing and then, first in human trials and then, phase 3 trials. We kind of go through that same development process with our therapeutics as well.
And I apologize if I missed this. Are the algorithms different for each one? You said the gates are, but do you then have to write a different algorithm for each one as well?
We do. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm going to assume since the clinician doesn't need to be right there, what this does is it allows wider application, but allows a clinician to track how their patient is doing, hourly or day by day and adjust based on how they're doing. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so the intervention itself is what we consider to be a standalone intervention. So we can ship this to somebody who has a stroke, and the intervention will be delivered autonomously by the product with no clinician input necessary. However, all of these folks, or most of these folks that we're going to be dealing with, have either a PCP or a neurologist or a physical therapist that they're seeing. So all of the data that we're collecting about how this person is progressing can then be shared with a clinician so that the clinician can track their progress. However, the clinician tracking their progress is more for informing maybe treatment planning, but not necessarily changing anything about our product because the product does it autonomously.
Right. So it's to help with the long-term planning with other opportunities. Okay. So why start a whole new company to do this? Why not just stay as a clinician? You were a clinician at a hospital, right? Why jump away from that and into your own thing?
Yeah, I love thinking about that journey when people ask me that, because there was at no point in my actually sort of education or growing up that I said, Brian, you're going to be the CEO of a tech company someday, or even to be completely honest, Brian, you're going to be a scientist or a researcher someday. That was not in the trajectory. In fact, that wasn't in the trajectory until I had started my first job, because I was a clinician and I'm a clinician by heart. I love the process of helping people, and I love helping people in that way. And so when we found that the intervention worked and we were seeing such great outcomes, what was happening to me was the demand for the services was far outweighing our ability to supply them as clinicians. And I had patients and their family members coming to me and saying, Brian, you helped my dad walk again. How do I get more of this when I leave the hospital? At the time, the answer was, there's nothing you can do. And as a clinician, that's a terrible conversation to have on a regular basis with patients and their family members. And so as this went on, there became this determination that I have found a need. I've found a solution to that need. I have the responsibility to do something about it. And so I started MedRhythms based upon that need, because I felt like we could make a bigger impact if I wasn't treating patients 40 hours a week. Not because I didn't want to be a clinician, but I felt like bigger impact could be made through business and through technology. Then as we started this process, it became very clear that now the research that we're pushing forward is actually going to be some of, I would say, valid, but is really going to help push the field forward, because we're getting some really unique outcomes that's going to demonstrate the power of music for rehabilitation. So I would say, why do that was really more because I felt it was necessary.
You said you're getting really powerful outcomes. Has there been anything that has surprised you about what you've been doing?
Yeah, it's interesting too, because you always ask yourself, right, as you start to think about building products, so this is an interesting podcast, right? So we're talking about science, but we're talking about science and technology and company and clinical application all at once, which is the beauty of my job, which is why I love my job, is because I get to do all of these many different hats. But as we started building these technology, this product, there's always the question of, is this going to be as good as a clinician, right? Is this going to actually be able to replicate what a clinician does? And so I distinctly remember the day that we did our first autonomous session, where I wasn't involved at all, and the product did what I wanted it to do or thought it should have. There was just this moment of, wow, like this is game changing for us, but potentially game changing for all those folks it will serve. The intervention of rhythmic auditory stimulation that we're autonomizing with our product has been studied in sort of the clinic, the lab setting, over different disease states, and shown that it works. It can improve outcomes, it can improve things like symmetry and stride length and gait speed, et cetera. In our very first feasibility study, we looked at chronic stroke survivors. So chronic stroke means people who are at least 6 months after their stroke has happened. Why that's classified as a different category is because typically when people reach that chronic stroke period, it's thought of that's when they're going to plateau. So that's, they've made all the functional gains that they're going to make in those first few months post-injury, and then they plateau. Typically around that 6 months to a year period is when insurance stops paying for things like physical therapy and some devices, et cetera. There's currently nothing on the market outside of like wheelchairs and walkers and things for that population. So there's a huge unmet need. So we actually did our first clinical trial in that population of chronic stroke to see if we could have an impact. What we found was, yes, we can have an impact. So we actually found results of our product were consistent with existing rhythmic auditory stimulation research. So we were improving baseline gait speed, biomechanics, et cetera. The two things that were most surprising about that surprised me as a clinician, number one was we also looked at metabolic data. So we looked at oxygen consumption while walking, which is typically in research or in biomechanics research is a metric of what they call walking economy. So you think about it sort of like gas mileage in a car almost, but for a human. And the easiest way to explain it is if you are walking more inefficiently, you use or you consume more oxygen while you walk. Because you're expending more oxygen, you're expending more energy as you're walking, so therefore you're consuming more energy while you're walking. And so we actually looked at metabolic data. If people are walking to rhythm and they're using our product and they're improving their biomechanics, does this actually have an impact on their energy expenditure or their walking economy? And what we found was that people actually, from pre to post session, so they did one session using our product, 30 minutes, that the group on average had a 10% reduction in oxygen consumption or a 10% improvement in their walking efficiency. So not only were they walking faster, but they were also using less energy to do it, that was incredibly compelling for us as researchers and clinicians. Number one, because that's never been studied before in rhythmic auditory stimulation, so that was a novel outcome. But number two is there's no reason why somebody who has a stroke, that outcome would be unique to that diagnosis. That this is really a human outcome, that when people walk to rhythm, they walk more efficiently. Now, could this have implications on endurance, on people's ability to walk farther distances, or healthy people, maybe in strength training or in running and these types of things? So a really compelling outcome, and it has implications, I think, in just about every disease state and non-disease state.
It's really interesting because a bunch of my friends who work out regularly insist that they need something with a beat. And it's going to be a very specific beat, right?
Right. So it's interesting because people ask me that all the time, about, well, can this apply to running? And people say, well, if I'm going to work out, I never work out without music. So what we do know, there's actually sort of two things that are at play. Because what we do know is when we listen to music, it's well researched that there's a dopamine response. And it's particularly when it's music that has high salience or high preference to the listener, that there's a dopamine response, and that there can also be sort of an adrenaline response, right? When you put on music that goes fast, your heart actually starts racing independent. A lot of people think about that as the reason why we need music. It's a distraction from the pain of exercise. It helps with my adrenaline, that's why people use it. There is that impact happening. But if people were to use music more purposefully, in the sense of identifying the tempos that were correct, identifying an actual strength or a regiment that actually changed the tempo of the music based upon what they were doing, that was more sort of clinical in nature, we actually might see better outcomes if you trained to that because of how the rhythm is impacting the motor system and potentially impacting efficiency of movement. I will not sit here as a good researcher and claim that this generalizes across populations. But an early hypothesis as we look at this is there's no reason why this shouldn't generalize outside of this particular population. But that's something that we're looking to study into the future.
So I have one question about, you said after one session, they improved. How long does that stick? Forever, or is it?
Fantastic question. And I think the easiest way to answer that is in terms of what we're looking at for outcomes. As we look at the metabolic data, so that oxygen consumption, we have no idea, to be completely honest. So that's never been looked at. Like I said, this was the first study that's ever even looked at that as an outcome in rhythmic auditory stimulation. However, when we look at the other outcome in that same study, so things like walking speed and symmetry and stride length, we're leveraging principles of neuroplasticity, which means that we know that when you engage in music, it can aid in the process of neuroplasticity, which leads to functional change or carryover change. However, frequency and consistency are important. Okay. So if you use the product once, it's not a magic bullet, you're cured for life. What we do see though, and this is why when we look at our outcomes, we look at your walking speed baseline day one versus baseline the day after your last intervention. Because we want to see, does this actually create a functional change in the person versus just a within session change.
By baseline, you mean they're not using your product,
Correct.
They're just walking. Okay.
So beginning of the session on day one versus, we'll call it, them walking around in the community the day after. And we do see that there's a statistically significant change in their walking speed from those two incidents, which means that there's a change happening. I will say nobody has yet done also a true, what we would consider to be a dosing study. So how much, how often, and then how long does it last? But we do know that there is a lasting effect, at least for a couple of weeks post intervention. And to caveat that, your brain is a muscle, right? So if you use your brain a lot and you create these changes and then you stop walking, you're going to have a decline, right? So there's a lot of things at play. So we are seeing that. We also have some early evidence from some of the neuroimaging research to support that there's actually anatomical change happening in the brain from pre to post. When anatomical change happens, that also means that functional change happens. So anatomy changes, which drives changes in functions like, movement and walking. But the other thing I wanted to point out, which is the answer to the question, the thing that surprised us the most. So when we looked at the data, I was blinded to who these people were. I have no idea their names. I didn't know anything about their demographic data until after the study. And when we were looking into the data, we had one particular person in the study who was what we call a super responder, which means that like over the whole study itself was 4 sessions over 2 weeks. We only looked at metabolic data in 1 session, but it was 4 sessions over 2 weeks. And there was one person who was a super responder, which means that from day 1 to day 5, when we looked at their walking data, they had a tremendous response. So if you looked at like gait speed, it went through the roof.
So total outlier compared to the other ones.
Yeah, I would say, the group on average improved, but this one, scope was much different. And what was most compelling is when we did some background, this woman was 20 years post-stroke. So not only was she surpassed that 6 months where they say like you're going to plateau, she was 20 years post-stroke and was the greatest responder in the study.
I just got goosebumps.
As do I, every day. And so, and that's actually some of that data, along with some of data from our other trials, is what we used to submit to FDA, which in June, we were just granted breakthrough designation on this chronic stroke product because of those outcomes, which is, again, it's still early. We still got a lot to sort of prove, I would say, and to build that out. But, early signals are very exciting here.
I can only imagine how great it is to work on this every day and think about the people whose lives you're helping change for the better, like people who really thought they had no chance. It's really inspirational. I mean, just to me, I just think it's really fantastic. I hope you every now and then take a step back and think about not only how cool this is, but how great it is that you're going to hopefully change so many people and make their lives better.
Well, I appreciate that very much. And I appreciate you saying that. That's what we think about. Actually, I think about that every day here because that's literally why we exist as an organization and I tell people that too, as we talk around, the water cooler here at the company, every decision that we make as an organization, whether this is a financial decision or who we hire as lawyers or who we hire as partners and these types of things, all centers around, does this decision help us help more people? And we have a long way to go until we are at a place where we feel like we've made the impact that we've always dreamed of and that we think we're capable of and that we want to make. And anytime you're going to build a medical device or be an entrepreneur in healthcare, get ready for the long haul, right? I mean, these are not quick sort of processes. These take years and years of development to get through all of these things. And that's the only way that we would be able to get through the years and years of the grind of doing this, is knowing that at the end of this, there are so many people that need help. And we've got something that potentially can change their lives. And so that's the conversation that we have every day. And the commitment that we have to doing this every day is with that end in mind. And so it's nice to call attention to it, but it really is the driving force of why we exist and why we do this every day.
I don't have anything to add to that except to say thank you for doing it. I have a totally separate question for you, one that I've been meaning to ask you now for the better part of a month. What's your favorite kind of music? Not for therapy, for you personally.
Oh, boy. It was interesting about that. So if we think about my musical journey here, which is fun to talk about sometimes, my first instrument ever was the viola. And I played in the Bangor Youth Symphony for a long time, actually from the time I was about 8 years old until I graduated high school. And I played in a quartet that was associated with the Bangor Youth Symphony. So that's where I really grew my love for classical music in that respect. As I sort of high school, college, I learned drum set, and that sort of took over as my primary instrument. And I played drum set, and I played in the classic college bands, and I played in pep band, and I played in concert band, and all of these things. And so I have found that my appreciation for musicianship outweighs my appreciation for music as like, what kind of music do I like? I can honestly appreciate, and I enjoy listening sometimes to say everything from like death metal to listen to like what they're doing musically oftentimes is absolutely incredible, all the way to listening to classical music, which obviously is musical in its own right. If I'm going to sit down and play music though, on like a drum kit, I love blues and I love funk music. That's the most exciting music to play, in my opinion, as a drummer. But like I said, I've performed jazz and rock and all of these things, and pop music, which is catchy and fun to listen to, but it's pretty eclectic. It's amazing that music can span, as we just talked in one conversation, from classical music to death metal, right? And everything in between. There's something for everybody here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the more accomplished someone is, the more they are able to appreciate how good other people are. So I may have told you I have a daughter who's a theater kid, and she looks at a play or a production at 18 in a totally different way than I do. I love it and I'm in awe by it. And she'll be like, whoa, did you see that lighting choice? I'm like, no, I just saw the whole thing. So while I don't actually personally get death metal, I can appreciate you saying that that's your thing. So if you were to pull out an instrument today, was it still drums? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
This is okay.
I have a kit set up in the basement, and I play when I can and when time is reasonable. But it's interesting too, because the same thing happens. I sit in the car with my wife and we're listening to a song, and I say, "Man, did you hear that bass line?" And she's like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, No, rewind. Listen to that bass line. But that's the level of listening, right? That you hear. And it's also funny too, because to become a music therapist, I had to become proficient on guitar, piano, and voice. And proficient means, essentially, that's a subjective term, but you need to be able to play all major, minor chords and understand theory and be able to compose songs and things like that. I had taken piano lessons when I was younger, so I had a base of knowledge. So that sort of came back a little bit more naturally. But I never had played the guitar before, ever. Before undergrad, because I was going to grad school and had to audition to get into grad school. So I had to learn how to play guitar. And my whole life has been centered around music in some way. Like, everybody knows that. Like, I perform, I love music, like it's awesome. And I realized that how frustrating it was for a musician to try to learn a new instrument. And at 21 years old, and I kept having this sort of flashback of understanding of like psychology here, that, the reason why I think it's so difficult for us to learn these things as we get older is because we have a much better understanding of how bad we are. And when you have that understanding of how bad you are, when you have a 7-year-old who's squeaking on a violin, I was that kid, right? Like, you're just playing, it sounds great, you're awesome. You don't have that perception of like what music is and how this should be. But then you're 21 years old and you watch a 12-year-old just shred on a guitar and you can barely put your fingers on a chord to put them together. And you're like, do I even want to do this?
Yeah, it's humbling, probably in a good way, but still. Yeah,
it sure is.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up here, Brian?
I appreciate the approach to the podcast around promoting science and things, but I think the Maine connection here is also really important, because there are some really incredible things happening here in the state of Maine that oftentimes people don't hear about and aren't highlighted. that not only can you be successful in whatever field that you want to be, whether it's being an entrepreneur or starting a company or being a scientist or working in healthcare, there's no doubt that places like Boston, San Francisco, Hong Kong for Tokyo are great healthcare hubs. But that doesn't mean you have to be there in order to be successful and to really make an impact. And we moved MedRhythms back to Portland, Maine, where our headquarters is, because we wanted to be here, because we cared about Maine and thought that we could be successful here. And there was lots of other data points of why that was a good decision for us. But I want to highlight that too, that this is something that's happening, and we're still connected with Harvard Medical School, and we're working with the top rehabilitation hospitals in the country for our clinical trials. And we're doing imaging studies, in Boston, but we're here in Portland, Maine, and it can be done here. So if there's anybody listening that needs that level of encouragement, I hope that means something as well, is that no matter where you come from, whether it's a state or a tiny little town like West Enfield, that shouldn't limit what your potential is, and that there's great things happening here in the state.
It's like I could have scripted it for you, what I've been trying to tell people for years. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate your time today. I know it was a lot of back and forth, mostly because of my surprisingly crazy schedule to get this to happen. So I really do appreciate it. But most of all, Brian, I appreciate that you're doing this in Maine and that you're doing such really great work. I look forward to talking to you again in the future when you have another clinical trial going on your next project.
Likewise, I look forward to chatting with you again. It's been an honor to be here. Talk to me in about 6 months. We have a number of things on the pipeline, so maybe we'll have some more to update at that point. But it was an honor to be here, and thanks for the work that you're doing to promote this work in Maine as well. It's needed, and it's an honor to be here, so thank you.
The Maine Science Podcast has received support from the Maine Technology Institute and is recorded at Discovery Studios in Bangor, Maine at the Maine Discovery Museum. The Maine Science Podcast is produced and edited by me, Kate Dickerson. I received production support from Maranda Bouchard, and the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.